Good morning, class. Welcome to the lecture on the types of research designs. I really like this lecture because it's very straightforward and it's relatively short, which is good news for everyone. So what I'm doing right now is I am deviating. So far, we've been going in the order of a research article. Right now I'm deviating a little bit because in the grand scheme of things, it'll be really useful to you if you know the main distinction between the types of research designs now. It'll help you put things together because, as you've probably figured out, all of the tools of research methods are kind of interlocking, and decisions on one are influenced by decisions on the other of what tool you use. So the types of research designs, what I'm going to talk about today is first I'm going to talk about why this is so important. I'm going to give you some grounding in the purpose of why we have different research designs. Then I'm going to talk about the two main categories of designs. The first category is correlational relationships, also known as non-experimental designs. And the second category is causal relationships, also known as experimental designs. So correlational versus causational, and non-experimental versus experimental. And then finally, I'm just going to really quick clear up a misconception that students have. Many students confound the types of research design with the research setting, and these are not the same thing. So in that lab versus field research, I'm going to misconstrue you of that notion. So here we go. Why is this so important? Well, it's really important because of a construct called internal and external validity. And you remember the last lecture or the lecture before when I said that a lot of the terms we use in research method are what is called terms of art. They're terms that we use that are words that might be something different in the real world, but to us, they have very specific meanings. And this is one of them. The word validity is used in several different ways, but in our discussion now, we're referring to internal and external validity. So just remember that internal and external validity have specific and special meanings to research methodologists. Now, before we even start this, we have to go back a couple of steps. Because believe it or not, this sounds very silly that we even have to cover it, but it's super important. So first thing we have to define is a variable. And a variable is any quantity or quality that can take on a range of values. So this is super important, and I know you think it's silly, but I've had students before forget to put the range in their variables. And now that I'm much more experienced and my GAs are much more experienced, we catch you guys from making those mistakes at the beginning. But in the early days, we didn't even think about it because it just seemed so automatic. For example, one student group, a long time ago, their hypothesis was that people would prefer teachers that were more enthusiastic. So that was their hypothesis. But when they asked their participants to take the study, they only asked participants in one class, my class. So they only got one level of enthusiasm for professors. So that whole variable, their two variables in their study were teacher enthusiasm and student preference. And teacher enthusiasm did not vary. So they couldn't say anything about student preference because they only measured one kind of teacher. So a variable is really important. And in experimental studies, we have two main kinds of variables. The first kind is called the independent variable. That's the variable manipulated in experimental studies and its value is set by the researcher. The other type of variable we have is called the dependent variable. The variable is measured. That's the one that's measured. That's our outcome variable in experimental studies. Some people have a much better time remember it if the dependent variable is the outcome. And its value depends upon the independent variable. And to be absolutely honest with you, there's no super easy way to remember this. I've never thought or seen a mnemonic or a puzzle or anything. So if you can think of anything, please let me know. But this one you just have to memorize at first. So remember that the dependent variable depends upon the independent variable. Now let me make that a little easier for you, or a lot easier for you, by giving you some examples. And the example that I really like in this case is a fake experiment that I used to do when we had in-person classes and I took my dog to class. So I conducted an experiment in front of the class, and I had my dog, Philip, in class. Really cute little guy with a brown curly tail. And I had dog treats. And so our hypothesis was that Philip's face would be cuter in a picture when we had a dog treat in front of him than in a picture when he didn't have a dog treat in front of him. Okay? So our hypothesis is that the dog would be cuter if he had a dog treat in front of him. So overall, dogs' faces are cuter when they have treats in front of them. And we all know that they are good little beggars. But we want to test this scientifically. So what we propose to do as a class is take a picture of Philip. One picture would be his face when there was a dog treat held right above the camera. And the other picture would be his face when there was not a dog treat held right above the camera. And we did a few extra things just to kind of foreshadow what we're going to learn in the class. We made sure that it was the same person in front of Philip for taking both pictures. We made sure that he had the same background behind him and it had the same lighting. Because remember, in an experiment, we want to make sure that if there's a difference between those two pictures, we want to make sure that it's due to the dog treat and not the lighting or the background. So we isolated our dependent variable. And so in that example, the independent variable was the one that we manipulated, that we messed with, that we, the experimenters, had control over changing. And in that one, the independent variable was the food, right? We controlled whether the food was there or it was not there. The dependent variable is the variable that depends upon the independent variable. So the dependent variable was how cute Philip was in the pictures. Or in our case, it was our ratings of how cute Philip was in the pictures. So the independent variable was the variable that's manipulated. The dependent variable is the variable that's measured. So in our case, we manipulated the food. Food was independent variable, and cuteness was the dependent variable. If you get it, independent variable is sometimes called the causal variable, and the dependent variable is sometimes called the outcome or result. So the independent variable can also be called the causal variable or thought of as the causal variable, and the dependent variable can often be thought as the outcome variable or a result. Now, a note here, the terms independent variable and dependent variable denote causality. So they are generally only used in experimental research. And we're going to talk more about the difference between experimental and non-experimental research in the rest of this lecture. But just note now that the terms independent variable and dependent variable technically can only be used in experimental research because they suggest that the independent variable is causing change in the dependent variable. Now, it only does so in the certain conditions that we've set up in our experiment, but that's what it suggests. So you've got that down, the independent variable versus the dependent variable. So that brings us, now that you understand that, you can understand the first type of validity. That's internal validity. And what that basically asks is the independent variable responsible for the observed changes in the dependent variable? So do we think that the dependent variable, the outcome variable, changed because we changed the first variable? Because we changed, do we think that the cuteness changed because of the food, or do we think it's something else? So is the independent variable responsible for the observed changes in the dependent variable? So in a picture form, that looks like, is this arrow really big? Do we think that's the reason that the independent variable causes changes in the dependent variable? We think that it's the independent variable and not some other variable that causes the changes. So in the example I gave in the last slide, it's the independent variable and not the lighting and not the person taking the picture. The lighting and the person taking the picture would be confounding variables. So we don't want them. That's not what we're testing. We're not testing, that's another study if we want to do it. We're not testing whether lighting changes his ratings of cuteness or whether the person taking the picture changes his rating of cuteness. We're testing whether food in front of him changes his cuteness. So we want to make sure that the independent variable causes changes in the dependent variable. And the degree to which we can be sure of that is called internal validity. So I like to think of that as the tightness of our study, the efficiency of our study. We want to make sure that we've thought of everything else that could possibly get in the way of our thinking that the independent variable causes changes in the dependent variable. So the extent to which everything is controlled, that's called internal validity. Internal validity is how sure we can be that changes in the dependent variable are caused by changes in the independent variable. So it's another way of saying it is internal validity is the extent to which we've gotten rid of confounding variables. In internal validity, we've controlled, that's what we call it, controlling for. We've controlled for all the confounding variables. We've gotten them out of the way one way or the other. There's lots of different ways you can do that, but we can talk about that later. So internal validity is how tight my study is. Now, if you think about it, I'll go back here. If we now thinking about generalizability, thinking about the degree to which we as researchers want to take what we found and apply it to the rest of the world, if we control every little thing, if we control the person, if we control the lighting, if we control the background, how much is that like Philip's real life? Not very much. In this case, we know that for one dog, for this lighting, for this background, for this person, the dog gets cuter. So we know for sure, because we controlled all those variables, that we have high internal validity, because we controlled everything that we could think of, except for the food and the dog, right? So we think we controlled everything we could think of. So we know the relationship between the food and cuteness is very strong because this study had high internal validity. But think about it for a minute. All alone at your computer, put your little thinking hat on, or a big thinking hat on if you have a big head, and think about it. If we've controlled every possible thing in that study, does that mean our study is generalizable to the real world? Not really. We can really actually only say that relationship between the food and the cuteness holds under conditions of the lighting we used, the person we used, the food we used, all kind of those things. That relationship depends on how we set up the study. So honestly, we don't know if it works for another dog. We don't know if it works for other food. We don't know if it works for other lighting. We do know for sure that it works really well between the way we set up our experiment, between our food, our dog, and the ratings of cuteness. But we don't know how well it holds for other conditions. So the degree to which it holds for other conditions is external validity. And external validity tells us whether the results apply to the broader population. Or in other words, do the results of our study apply to the real world? Does it work for lots of dogs? Does it work for lots of food? Does it work for lots of conditions? We don't know from our study. In order to do that, we'd have to do another study with high external validity. But as you probably figured out by now, that external validity and internal validity have reciprocal relationships. So internal validity means that we can be really, really sure that relationships between the variables are a true relationship between the variables because we've controlled the confounding factors. But external validity has a lot more, or external validity tells us that it's applicable to the real world. It works in the real world. So let me give you an example of something with high external validity. I don't know, probably about 20 years, I'm getting older and older every day. Probably about 20 years ago, big studies came out showing that, and there was a relationship between flossing your teeth and heart disease. So what the study behind those findings was that there was a huge population study, and they asked people about all kinds of health behaviors, and they asked people whether they had a heart attack yet or whether they had heart disease yet. And they found out from that study of thousands and thousands of people that people who didn't floss were more likely to have heart disease. So we knew that because we've asked thousands and thousands of people, that study had good external validity, totally applicable to the real world. We know by asking so many people, and we did statistics to make sure that our results weren't due to chance, that relationship between flossing and heart disease held up in the real world. However, the problem with that, we knew there was a relationship. It had high external validity, but we didn't know why. It could have been why for a couple things. It could have been why, and some people propose that flossing gets rid of bacteria between your teeth and along the gum line. And if you don't get rid of it, that bacteria can eventually build up and make its way to the heart and contribute to heart disease. So that's kind of the bacteria theory. The other thing some people thought was that it was conscientiousness. So basically, the more conscientious people floss their teeth, and the more conscientious people were also likely to do other behaviors that would avoid heart disease, like walking, exercising, eating healthy, and all that stuff. So we had a couple different ways to explain the relationship between flossing and heart disease. The only way we could know what was causing the relationship with heart disease would be to do other studies with higher internal validity. We would have to control the confounding factors. We would have to control for other people's health behaviors. We'd have to get those out of the way and then just look at the relationship between flossing and heart disease. So we'd have to get out those extra behaviors out of the way. And there's a mathematical way to do that. Not quite as good as a true experiment, but it helps us be a little more sure. Or we would have had to do a study and actually identify the bacteria and then probably not in people, and I wouldn't even want to do this in animals, but we'd have to find a chemical pathway from the tooth bacteria to heart disease, which would involve some highly controlled studies with high internal validity. So these two types of studies are great. They're really important in science. Remember, I've been talking, and I think I've said it a million times by now, that relationships in science, what we know about the world is not just one study, it's lots of studies. And so this example I just gave you about the flossing and the heart disease is a really good example of how it takes lots of studies to identify how something works. And the studies ideally should vary in their validity. Those with high external validity tell us how applicable our findings are to the real world. Those with high internal validity tell us how strong, how sure we are that this is how it works, that variable A causes variable B. So external validity tells us that variable A and B are related in the real world, that in real life, if we look in the population, that's what we're going to find. Internal validity tells us that the relationship between A and B is a causal relationship. So I'm going to, I think that's it. Yeah, there, I finally made it do it. That's my little seesaw that shows that they have a reciprocal relationship. I'm going to take a break right now, and I'll join you back in a few minutes to talk about correlational research.